Hello everyone and welcome back to another Wizard101 video. In the last few weeks, I have made a few videos on the death of certain topics in Wizard101. Now if you haven't watched those videos, basically in them I go over the history of a certain aspect of the game and I talk about how it declined over time. Today's video is going to be similar to that, talking about the history of something, but in today's video I'm not talking about the death of something. This is something that I actually think is the opposite even. It is changed for the better. However, I do still have a few issues with the topic, and that is the boss design of Wizard101. Now in today's video, I'm basically going to analyze it from the beginning, the shifts that it's had, and then towards the modern boss design. And then I also want to talk about the problems I still have with the boss design in this game, and how I think that really there are a few simple fixes that would make this game much more not only balanced, but much more interesting and a bit diverse. But enough intro, without further ado, let's get into the video talking about the boss designs of Wizard101. Alright, now to start off this video, let's talk about the initial boss design of Wizard101 and very early game bosses. This is very specifically going to be the Arc 1 bosses, like anything from Wizard City up to Dragonspire. Also included in that to a lesser extent is Grizzleheim and Wisteria, and that is where boss enemies are designed to be basically a regular mob enemy, but much more powerful with a much more amount of health. So to give an example right here, we have Vasic Ashweaver in Dragonspire. This is what I would consider to be the average Dragonspire level boss, where you can see he has 5600 health. He's much more powerful than the regular mob enemy, but he's not anything outstandingly different in terms of design than regular mob enemies. He has a very similar deck, he has a similar amount of resistances, everything like that. The only real difference with him is that he has 5600 health. This is actually the standard for Arc 1 and the initial boss design of this game. They were designed to be just slightly more challenging mobs, and that increased world by world along with the difficulty of the mobs. So for example, for Wizard City, the bosses have between like 300 up to 600 health. In Krokotopia, they have between 600 and 1000. In Marleybone, they have from 1000 to about 2000. Mushu is actually the first difficulty jump, where they get up to like between 2000 and 5000. And then finally, Dragonspire, the bosses range anywhere from 2000 all the way up to 8000 with Malastare Drake. Now, very obviously, I shouldn't have to say this is the most simplistic boss design has ever been in this game. It wasn't designed to be anything specifically mentally taxing. It was just supposed to be slightly more difficult than regular mobs, and each world they get slightly more difficult on top of that. And it's no wonder that KingsIsle decided to change their design philosophy within like a year or two of this game coming out. Now with Celestia, they introduced the first major shift in terms of boss design in this game. However, they continued along the same lines that they had been before. They increased the difficulty of bosses by increasing the amount of health they have. So every world in Arc 2 follows that philosophy, and it ramps up significantly compared to Dragonspire. Celestia isn't too much more difficult than Dragonspire. Zafaria is a bit more. Bosses have up to like 8000 health on average. Then in Avalon, they get even higher. They go between 8 to 12,000 health. In Azteca, it is a huge jump and they get between 12 and 15,000. And then Chrysalis is where things really peak, and every boss has between 10 to 20,000 health. However, that's not the thing that I want to focus on with this next section. What I want to focus on is the introduction to cheats in this game. Now, the introduction of cheats and the cheats in Arc 2 are what I'm going to call simplistic cheats. These cheats aren't anything insanely difficult. In fact, the most difficult cheats in this game were side dungeons that weren't actually like necessary to go through the game. Most of the major bosses had what I would consider to be like a minor cheat. So for example, in Celestia, I believe there are 2 or 3 separate bosses that had a cheat where they put a -90 shield on themselves. To remove it, you either had to use the Pierce spell or the Shatter spell on a myth, or they usually had a counter. Like for example, I believe Ptolemos in the Trial of Spheres, if you put a blade up, he will remove his -90. That was the initial design to cheats in this game. They were something that was supposed to be easily countered, but easily followable, and they weren't designed to be like insanely difficult, because if they were, the health that the enemy had was way too much. I think if you want to look at the bosses that peaked during this design period and were the most powerful, you could look at Sylster Glowstorm from Waterworks, where he had his alternating blade and trap cheat, or you could look at Malastare the Undying and Castle Darkmoor, who had many different cheats. Honestly, any of the Darkmoor bosses could be considered the peak of cheats during this time. I will say, I do think that this is when the game got significantly more difficult, but also a little bit more interesting, because the bosses were significantly less one-dimensional compared to Arc 1. However, there were a few major flaws during this time, and let's talk about the biggest one in my opinion, and that is the fact that this is when bosses became damage sponges. I'm talking about way back in the day before the 20% health reduction, where every Chrysalis boss had between 20,000 to like 30,000 health, health, it was absolutely insane, and every boss fight took a very long time to do. In my opinion, the reason why this was a major flaw is that it was artificially lengthening the difficulty of the fights. It was making enemies have way too much health for realistically no reason. It wasn't like it was adding anything exceptionally challenging to the fight, it was just making them take a little bit longer. If you want a comparison, and in my opinion why I think this difficulty is kind of a bad design choice, look at something like Skyrim. If any of you have played Skyrim, the difficulty setting in that game is very simplistic and honestly does the exact same thing. What it does is the more you increase the difficulty, the less damage you do and the more damage the enemies do to you. I believe at the highest difficulty, I don't remember exactly what it is, but I think the enemy is doing like 32 times damage to you and you're doing 32 times less damage to them or something crazy like that. It is absolutely insane, and it's kind of what they did during this period. A lot of people didn't really like this and wanted it to change, which is what KingsIsle did. Alright, we're here in the best world in Wizard 101 to talk about the great boss shift of 2015. That is what I'm going to call it. This is when bosses changed drastically, and many would consider to be for the better. Now, this is where KingsIsle decided that their boss design philosophy was just simply not going to work anymore. With the previous world, again, this was before the 20% health reduction, the bosses had between 20,000 to 30,000 health in this game on top of having cheats, and simply that was just artificially inflating how difficult every encounter was. Every encounter felt like a slog, and it felt like it took way too much time. So KingsIsle was like, well, what do we do? And with that, they introduced Polaris. Now, Polaris is very interesting because boss design is completely and utterly different. The average boss of Polaris has around 10,000 health, which, to put into perspective, that is what the old Avalon bosses had. So you may be questioning, well, what did they do to counter that? Well, they tried to make it so that the bosses had interesting and more compelling cheats instead. So there are certain bosses that have like late cheats now, where if you enter the fight late or if you flee and come back, they will interrupt cast something that will significantly debilitate your health. They also have certain cheating bosses that just affected the fight much more directly. Like, for example, in the Sunless Shrine, if you remember the fight with Johnniak and Toniak, where they have one that's lying and one that's telling the truth, that is a much more different fight than literally anything KingsIsle had designed up until this point. And that continues on pretty much for the next two worlds. Mirage doesn't really have the most difficult encounters. There are a few where, like the Scorpion, for example, has quite the difficult cheats. And then in Imperia, they also do something similar where the most challenging bosses are all bosses that have cheats. And then every once in a while, they would actually combine it with the old system. So for these, look at like Grandfather Spider, where Grandfather Spider, he has like 30,000 health and has difficult cheats. Or you could look to like the Trident at the end of Imperia, where you had to hit him for 20,000 health 3 separate times. Even that is much more different and more difficult than anything in Arc 2. So this great shift in boss design was designed to focus way more heavily on cheats and way less heavily on the enemies being damage sponges. Now let me talk about what I think about this. First off, I do think this was a very good decision, and it definitely did a lot for the game. It made Arc 3 feel even more fresh compared to Chrysalis as well, where Chrysalis was not only long, but the bosses were way too tanky. This made it a little bit better. However, I will say something, and I think a lot of people agree with me on this. I do think that they went just a step too much in that direction. The bosses in Polaris, while they are much more interesting and a breath of fresh air, they're also really easy. And in fact, if you didn't watch my live stream where I was just playing through Polaris on my Storm, you can actually solo most bosses on a Storm Wizard, which is notoriously hard to solo through, like, especially Arc 2, without really any problems. As long as you double feint into like a 7-pip AoE, you're going to be having a great time. So I do genuinely think that Arc 3 is a little bit on the easy side, and I do think that the average boss maybe should have a little bit more health, but I do think it was a massive step in the right direction. Alright, now following Arc 3 and the kind of easiness of it, with Arc 4, KingsIsle definitely stepped up their game significantly. Not only did they increase the boss's health a decent amount, so the average health of a boss in Arc 4 is like 15 to 20,000, but they also significantly ramped up the cheats in Arc 4. I can't stress enough the insane difficulty jump between Arcs 3 and Arc 4. Now, what exactly do I mean by this, and where can you see this? Well, in Caramel, there are only 14 total bosses. However, most of those bosses are notorious for for being the hardest solo encounters in this entire game because those bosses were designed to be insanely difficult. In the Nibelheim Mines, there is the fight of the Bulldozer. In that fight, every time he hits you with a natural attack, it will do 33% of your total health. What this means is if you're incredibly unlucky and he chooses to spam his natural attack, you are going to get absolutely wrecked in that fight. On top of that, there's the Aberrant Paradox fight where you need to beat all of his minions before beating him, and the chance of them casting a bad juju is actually pretty high. And then, probably one of the most notorious fights of all time that was actually just updated very recently was the King Gobsmack fight right here, where you have to fight the Oogie Boogies. If you don't remember that fight, every time you beat one, it takes out 25% of your health, and you need to beat 2 waves of them. This was notorious for being one of the hardest fights in this entire game for a very long time, and realistically, if you weren't a death or a life wizard, it was nigh impossible to solo. Now, another thing I want to talk about with Arc 4, and this is another huge thing, is this is when they decided to ramp up the difficulty even more by giving the enemies an insane amount of damage and pierce, which, yes, that is fine, but it did make it so that if you don't have the best gear setup, you are going to be struggling massively. Now, while I don't hate this design philosophy, a lot of fights no longer were really even feasibly soloable in this game. There were a lot of fights in Arc 4 where realistically, if you didn't have a team, you were kind of screwed. Like, there was no way you could really beat it solo. That's not to say you couldn't, but like for the average player, you definitely couldn't. I think ultimately, if you want to look at Arc 4's boss design and kind of their design philosophy around this time, you don't have to look really anywhere other than Wallaroo. Wallaroo has some of the worst boss fights in this game. I think recently they were actually changed, but for a long time they did, where there were 5 solo Urk fights, and one of them, the one against Confusion and Freddy Croker, was probably one of the worst solo fights in this entire game. And on top of that, some of the bosses, especially towards the end, like Freddy Croker and then like the Novus fights, were just simply much more challenging than what you'd expect. The enemies did a ton of damage, their decks were really annoying, and on top of that, they had high health and really complex cheats. I think at this stage of the game, a lot of people's complaints were the fact that bosses just became way too complex. Like, if you look at a cheat page, instead of the Arc 3 cheat pages where it's maybe 1 to 2 lines of text, every boss has like 6 separate lines of text detailing their different cheats. And I think that this could be called the Wiki Era. This is where, realistically, if you're not looking up the boss's cheats before going into the fight, you are not going to win. And I think that that was a huge problem, and it's really no wonder that they kind of shifted again coming into Arc 5. Alright, here we are in Darkmoor with Arc 5 and the modern boss design philosophy of this game. Now let me just say, it hasn't changed that much from Arc 4. The cheats are still very complex, and there still tends to be a lot of them, and the bosses tend to have quite a bit of health. So what has changed significantly? Well, I will say I do think that the cheats have gotten much more straightforward with Darkmoor. And really, to look at this, I feel like I don't need to look anywhere further than my very first playthrough of Darkmoor. The very first time I went through this world, I went through it with my friend the day it came out, and we looked up nothing from the test realm. We just duoed the entire thing, going through it, trying our best to figure out the cheats as we went through. Let me just say, I think this was the most amount of fun I have ever had playing Wizard101, because the boss design of this world is really good in my opinion. A lot of the bosses, while they do tend to have quote-unquote complex cheats, they're significantly less annoying and much less hard to figure out than the Arc 4 bosses. Like, we were very easily able to say like, oh, this boss doesn't allow this, or oh, this boss will do this when we do this, so on and so forth. The cause and effect was very easy to see, and it wasn't overly complex to the point of not being able to figure it out. And in fact, the only boss that we did not successfully duo in this entire world was the Lord Barghest fight, because when we did it, it was bugged and none of the other cheats activated besides the main like damage one, which meant that as a duo we simply could not do enough damage to beat him up. So I do think that the boss design philosophy in Arc 5 is much better so far. The idea that you can see the enemy's cheats and easily counter them without having to look them up is something that I really enjoy actually, and from now on I'm definitely going to be doing that upon doing the worlds. I do think if you compare this to Arc 4, where realistically I think finding out the cheats of bosses there would have been nigh impossible, impossible in a lot of cases, here it's much better and much more straightforward, which I quite like. Alright, now at this point, I have talked about every arc in this game. I've started at the beginning where the bosses were very simple, no cheats, to when they developed cheats, to when they decided to do the reset and make their health lower, to the rise of the Wiki Era with the very complex cheats, to the kind of modern era. Let's get into something I haven't talked about yet that I think is a fundamental design flaw in the boss design of Wizard101 that I absolutely hate, and that is the fact that every boss has a minion. Now you may be wondering, Noah, why is that a problem? Like, what are you talking about? Like, obviously a boss is going to have a minion. They're going to have someone to support them, right? Well, I think that fundamentally, this has made the game a little bit stale. And the reason why is that because every boss in this game has a minion, they have someone with them when you beat them up, what this means is that there is never a time in this entire game where it makes more sense to use a single target hit rather than an AoE spell. I've talked about it many times in the past, but there is a horrific quote-unquote meta right now where everyone in this game uses AoE spells, which is area of effect. It basically casts the spell on every enemy. I'm sure all of you know that. The current way that we get through this game is you use 4-pip AoEs up until Wallaroo, then you use the Wallaroo AoEs on every mob fight, and then once you get to a boss fight, you switch to your 7-pip AoE. The main reason is that 7-pip AoEs do not have the damage fall off that every other AoE spell has, and it means that it's simply just as effective as a single target hit. But what I want to stress in this section is that if every boss in this game didn't have a minion, we wouldn't have as much reason to use an AoE spell. The reason why it is so commonplace and everyone uses one is because every boss fight in this game, there's never going to be a reason to use a single target hit when you also need to take out the minion. So if for some reason a KingsIsle dev is watching this and they're like, oh hey, it's a Noah video talking about the state of the game, and you're still watching by this point and you haven't clicked off, I think that every boss in this game having a minion is a real problem. And in fact, most of my favorite boss fights in the last few years have all been the ones where there's not a minion, because it means I can actually diversify which cards I use and which cards make sense to use. Like for example, I talked about the Urk fights and how I think that they were pretty bad and pretty like unfun in a lot of cases. I think that's mainly because of the cheats, because personally, the idea of a 1v1 against a specific boss is actually really appealing. And for me, you could see this with like the puzzle piece monster. I thought that that fight was pretty fun actually. And I think that 1v1s are something that could be very appealing in this game, or even like 2v1s or 3v1s. I know it seems a bit weird. Really, the only thing that minions add to a boss fight, in my opinion, is simply that they make it so that you need to use an AoE spell. Regardless if they're there or not there, it doesn't really make a boss more challenging, especially later on. It just makes it a little bit more annoying. So to cap off this video, what are my thoughts on the boss design of this game overall? I think personally, the peak of boss design in this game so far has been Arc 3 and Arc 5. I think the main reason for that is simply that in Arc 3, the cheats haven't gotten complex enough to the point where you need to Google all of them, but I do think that there is the problem of the bosses being a little bit on the weak side, and I think Arc 5 is currently in a very good state where it is like just complex enough where you are going to struggle, but not complex enough where you need to Google the cheats. And I think it is personally the best I've ever seen it. My least favorite of the boss designs would have to be Arc 4 and Arc 1. Arc 1 simply because it's way too easy, and then Arc 4 simply because KingsIsle went way too overboard with the cheats. I think that those are kind of like eh, and then Arc 2 is fine, but I dislike how damage spongy the enemies are, and it is one of my lesser favorite boss designs in this game. It's just not as bad as I would consider Arc 1 and Arc 4 to be. So I do think the boss design in this game is actually one of its strong points. I do just wish that there were less minions, because I do think that minions make it very much a samey, oh, use an AoE spell. If minions didn't exist, AoE spells would be much less of a problem than they are right now. So I think that that's going to be it for today's video. First off, in the comments below, please let me know, what is your favorite era of boss design in this game? Which time did you enjoy the most, and which one do you find to be the best? And what do you think about bosses in this game generally? I would love to hear it. But beyond that, if you want to, I would love it if you dropped a like at the sub button. You can also join and become a channel member. But either way, thank you all for watching. I will see you in the next video. Have a good one.